Hello and welcome to the latest of my deep dive videos. This one is a special presentation exploring the eclipses of the autumn-fall 2022. Now the first of these occurs on the 25th of October in the sign of Scorpio, but the second on the 8th of November is in the sign of Taurus, the sign that's opposite Scorpio. Now the reason that I'm exploring these together is because the two events are not separate, they're intrinsically linked because they're activating the axis across the second and eighth houses of our overall situations. Now if you tuned in to me last autumn when I was predicting what 2022 would hold for us, the fact that the North Node reversed back into the sign of Taurus, the true North Node, on the 18th of January, and of course that joined up with the disruptive energies of Uranus already in the sign of Taurus, you can see that the events that have unfolded so far this year in terms of the energy crisis, increased interest rates, a limitation on availability of foodstuffs, it really has been a very, very volatile and unpredictable mix. So what can we expect over the next 6 months? How will these two events play out? What have we got to gain from them? And also, what are the potential challenges? So what I'm going to do today is go through this very carefully and explain to you in as a relatable way as possible the true astrology behind these events, and also help you to understand what you can expect in terms of your zodiac sign or ascendant over the next 6 months. Now I will tell you there is an outcome lunar eclipse which occurs on the 5th of May 2023, which looks very bright. And the reason for that, even though the sun will be in Taurus and the moon will be in Scorpio at the time, and Uranus will still be in the mix, it's that Venus, the ruler of Taurus, is going to be aspected beautifully by Jupiter, the planet of hope. So the two planets of possibility, the lesser and greater benefics, are linking brilliantly on the outcome of the lunar eclipse that I tell you about of the 8th of November. And in terms of the solar eclipse, well, this one ends the series in terms of the signs of Scorpio and Taurus, and the next one occurs on the 20th of April next year, 2023, in the sign of Aries, all about new beginnings. We're also going to have the North Node moving into Aries next year on the 13th of July, but that particular eclipse is also conjunct Jupiter. So we have some outcomes coming from these two events today. But if you're new to my channel, I would be delighted if you would subscribe. Please click or tap on the bell notification symbol. And also, if you'd like to know what year 2023 will hold for you as an individual, ascending above your zodiac sign, if you give me 3 pieces of personal birth data of time, date and place of birth, I can provide your forecast for you. But if you order it in 2022, you'll get the rest of this year free, plus your life roadmap, your character analysis, which can help to guide you, help you to understand some of the repetitive patterns that may have come up in your situation that have been tricky, and how to deal with them better, but also how to seize upon your talent and utilize it more fully. And there's 30% off with my special package. Please see the link below. So first of all, let's have a look at that partial solar eclipse which occurs on the 25th of October. And on the screen now you can see where it's occurring in all the big cities of the world. Now this is one of those events where the same date is shared for everybody collectively. Now what we get with a partial solar eclipse is that we don't actually see much. It's a dark moon, isn't it? If we have a new moon, there is no physical evidence of what we can see. But actually, this solar eclipse is really unique because of the role of Venus. And in fact, Venus also influences the lunar eclipse, which occurs on the 8th of November. Venus is actually being very influential over the last couple of months in general. Venus rules two zodiac signs, and it's important to understand that its governorship of Taurus is very much about its appreciation of sensuality, good food, good wine, security, continuity, firm foundations, self-worth. Its rulership of the sign of Libra is much more to do with our relationships, but also to do with presentation, aesthetics, style. Anything to do with fashion, I feel, is very strongly influenced in a way by both signs, but particularly by Libra, because it's very much about shaping a perception. So the fact that Venus is so close to this event is really notable. But of course, Venus, ruling the sign of Taurus, is therefore in its detriment in the sign of Scorpio. So what does Venus and Scorpio represent? Well, Scorpio is very much about a sign of being very invested. It's a serious sign, it's fixed, and of course it's watery, and it's ruled by the passionate Mars traditionally, and by the transformational energies of Pluto in terms of modern astrology. So having Venus there, right on the Sun and the Moon, is certainly going to give us a lot of desire, I feel, because the sign of Scorpio, governed by Mars, is about passion. Mars is also about instant gratification, but it can be about transformations. Now, of course, the other side of Scorpio is it can be very much to do with penetrative understanding, really thinking deeply into situations, understanding the mystique of our existences. And it can also be to do where things make way in our lives. And because Venus can influence relationships through its governorship of the sign of Libra, if there is a relationship in your world that the standards or values of that other person are not matching yours, or their attitudes to resources or money or saving or property, then that may be something you're really going to have to grapple with over the next 6 months. But equally, Venus can be very alluring. So even though it's technically in detriment, it feels things very, very deeply in the sign of Scorpio. Venus and Scorpio people tend to see things in relationships in quite black and white terms. They either really, really like you or more, or they really, really don't. So one of the things that we have to be aware of here is that something may be in the process of changing. And in terms of the more prosaic influence of Scorpio, that can have a big impact on things like property, investment, savings, stocks and shares, anything to do with mutual money, so the things that we share between two people, even the relationship we share with our financial institution, whether it's our card issuer, our mortgage provider and so on. So Scorpio very much around those energies. Also, you often find people who are involved in business and finance have a lot of 8th house in their charts, which is very Scorpionic, or Scorpio itself, or Mars and Pluto could be in the 2nd and 8th houses in a natal chart of someone who otherwise has no other Scorpio. And that Scorpionic energy can see them engaged in understanding how to steer resources, or strangely but true, very often at the end of life, people who are involved in palliative care, perhaps involved in psychology, in terms of transformations, or it could be people who are even undertakers. And obviously bankers and insurance brokers very often have some kind of Scorpio value to their charts. So what Venus is saying to us here, I feel, is to be conscious of the things that we have and we enjoy, but not to take them for granted, because we're living in a very, very difficult world situation. And there are also other energies playing out on this particular event. So Jupiter, the planet of growth, for example, is at 0 degrees in its retrograde in the sign of Aries, but it's in a quincunx with this event. Now Jupiter likes to give it large through its rulership of Sagittarius, much more spiritual through its rulership of Pisces. But here we get an inconjunct, a 150-degree angle, which makes it difficult to balance what we want as individuals, the first house, with where we need to collaborate and perhaps work with others, where we're most invested. So if you're someone who is a very free-spirited person, that particular aspect alone could test your commitment, your investment, your devotion into a particular cause, whether it's a business, whether it's a relationship, whether it's a sexual affair. It depends on your unique situation. Now also, Saturn in Aquarius in house 11 for us all collectively is in a square with Uranus and the North Node in the sign of Taurus. So that's showing us that there's a real pinch point. And it's been going on, of course, for the last couple of years between what we all want from a situation as human beings and what the reality is in terms of everyday money. So, for example, we've seen quite a lot of industrial unrest. We've also seen an uprising in Iran, which is very much to do with differing values, the values that have persisted over a long period of time, with new, much more open, much more consensual values. The two don't match. So that particular aspect is something that we've all been feeling tension from, but particularly in 2021. Now, the aspect is being repeated, or has been repeated, in October, particularly from the 2nd through to the 12th, within 1 minute. It didn't go exactly square. But through to the end of November, in fact the 3rd of December, within 3 degrees, those two are in a quarrel still. So they're going to have a big impact on these two eclipses. But then Neptune in Pisces is in that long-standing square with Mars. And that's causing a lot of gossip, a lot of distortion of information. If you have felt rather drained and deflated and dispirited, that aspect won't be helping. Now, it was exact on the 12th of October, and it's going to go exact again on the 19th of November. And then again, it's going to come back in March. So that's a bit of a punishing influence on this first event too. And also Mercury in the sign of Libra, which is brilliant for discussion and being a bit more detached about hearing different viewpoints. That's in a quincunx with Neptune, again adding to that sense of finding it difficult to get a kind of working consensus going. Now, perhaps most concerningly, in terms of the more volatile energies going on in Ukraine, we also have Mars in the 3rd house in Gemini in a quincunx with Pluto in the 10th house in Capricorn. But I think that aspect does feed into the narrative of what's going on in Iran, for example, because Mars in Gemini is very much about the forceful and vociferous outpouring of point of view, and that also could be informing some of the industrial disputes going on. Pluto in Capricorn is very much about the orthodox, the old power systems that have prevailed, particularly since 2008 in the sign of Capricorn. But I was thinking about Pluto's journey through Sagittarius, which is very much about the free market, and the free market politics and everything being ruled by consumerism. It's not working out so well at the moment, is it really? Because what it's done is broken down that sense of community. So we've got powers to be in Russia and China and North Korea and other parts of the world, Eritrea, where a very ruthless approach, and Iran of course as well, a very ruthless approach to people's viewpoints that may be different to theirs. So this particular aspect between Mars and Pluto is certainly informing this particular solar eclipse. But of course Venus does have its upside. It's very beguiling. It's, very coquettish, in that combination with the Sun. And, Venus conjunct the Moon is a beautiful aspect to have. If you have that in your natal horoscope, the chances are you will have a beautiful home, and your home and the environment of your home is very, very important to you. And of course, what Scorpio energy can also do is tease out corruption as much as manifested it in the first place. So we're going to see much more news stories, or many more news stories, about the misappropriation of power. So that's an absolute given over the next 6 months. But for us all, I think what Venus points us in the direction of is trying to come to a point where we value ourselves, but not linked to the material plane. So that may mean winding in some indulgences. Yes, we may have to turn the heating down. Yes, we may find that we're eating out a bit less, but we also have to remember that for some other people, it's not a question of making those choices. It's a question of actually eating or heating at all. So for those people who are rather more fortunate in terms of their resources, very Scorpionic, Venus can be extravagant, it's a time to perhaps become much more conscious of our consumerism, but not be upset that if we have to change things a little bit, because we've been living through a period of time where, obviously finance has been very cheap, and that has created a lot of consumption, but it hasn't been done with much awareness of what the outcome of that consumption has, particularly in terms of the planet. So the sign of Scorpio is very much about transformations at its best. It can be the end of things that don't work well, but it can be the beginning of something that works better. But I think that we're also addicted to getting what we want, when we want, so quickly, and we're so geared up to this now that it's going to be difficult to almost sort of throw off the desire to have these enjoyable treats and be able to free to go and do what we wish and get what we want when we want. I think that there's going to be a breaking down in the ease of doing that, which will make people feel insecure in some ways. But I think a lot of people watching this video will not be so insecure. They'll be more concerned about making ends meet, or actually recognizing that consumerism on its own is not the answer to all our needs. It's not a panacea. What's really important is how we connect as human beings. So in terms of the event chart based on the solar eclipse, the ascendant, so this is the proper astrology, not the overall chart, the simple birth chart will, which is very much to do with the collective. The event chart sees an ascendant in Sagittarius, very much about our need to be free. But it also sees Mars on the 7th house cusp. I'll do what I want when I want. That's pretty uncompromising. But we do see a great link between Mars, Mercury and Saturn, a ground air trine, which suggests that if we find a way to communicate better, we will start to find a greater sense of connection. But you can see from this event chart will that the gathering of the eclipse itself is in the 10th house. That's how we're all connected in the wider world, but particularly in terms of work, business, government, the more corporate structures that we're used to connecting with. Now you can see that the other influences in this chart that are really absolutely obvious in terms of where we are as person kind is that Saturn's in the 2nd house of everyday resources, very Taurus, but because it's Aquarius, that's the collective, but we also have Pluto there as well. Now Saturn's clashing big time with Uranus and the North Node, but Saturn being in that location is saying to us we have to become a bit more thrifty, but not necessarily just to make ends meet, because we start to understand what consumption does to the planet. It bends the planet, it poisons the planet big time, and that's something to really be mindful of. Now you can see that Jupiter in Aries is in the 3rd house in the event chart, which is our ideas, and that's in that quincunx with the Sun, the Moon and Venus. So that's really saying to us, we may have the idea that we want to do what we want to do as individuals, very much Jupiter in the sign of Aries, but in the third house. But it's just saying, be mindful of what the overall impact of our behaviour, consumer patterns, the things that we purchase, the things that we hold dear, what are the real value of those things to us. And with Uranus in the 5th house, along with the North Node, we're feeling rebellious. We don't want to change our behaviour because it's rather nice to do what we want when we want, phone up, get this, that, and sort of groovy food choices. Don't be thinking about groovy food choices, thinking about all the things that are in that food. So if we can get things back down to a more naturalistic level, that's when we're going to start healing ourselves as well as the planet, and perhaps keeping our pockets a little bit more intact. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the event chart for the solar eclipse. But I'll just share the simple birth chart will again, so you can see that on the screen, that we have the Sun, the Moon and Venus all in house 8. Very Scorpionic, and we have Aries in house 1. And just look out for that Mars quincunx with Pluto. I think that's a real big one, because that points towards great volatility when it comes to military weapons. It could also point towards some kind of attack on communicational systems. We've obviously seen something happen with this bridge that's occurred in the Kerch Strait between Crimea and Russia. That's an infrastructural project that somehow or another something's gone on there. But we've also had the talk of some kind of attack on a gas pipeline. And this Mars quincunx with Pluto does point towards sinister behaviour, or the use of a force which is completely beyond the level of acceptability on the basis of some kind of dogma. Mars in Gemini and Pluto in Capricorn, very much about imposing the power. So we are hearing about some very grim stories about what's happened to citizens, ordinary folks, particularly within the Ukraine. And that's, very, very awful. So some of these stories of corruption, of the use of force to its absolute degree, are going to come out more and more. But let's now discuss this lunar eclipse, because I want to tell you the last time that we had this pairing between the two was in 2012 and 2014, but also before then it was in 2002 and 2003. So you can see how the eclipse pairings work, and it's very important to see that normally with a solar eclipse or a new moon we're setting our intention. So with Scorpio and Venus there, we're thinking we want sex, we want a more exciting love life if we've already got a relationship, sex perhaps if we're single. If we don't necessarily want that outcome in our situation, maybe we want more security around our finances, but that seems very elusive at the moment, except of course if you're a saver, and obviously higher interest rates will probably have you purring. But what we want is something that tries to meet most people's needs at some level. It would be rather idealistic to think that we can meet everyone's needs, but that, being an Aquarius, would be something that I would think is something we should certainly try towards, rather than having a system that's just dominated by big business, big money, and some people getting the rewards and everyone else having to fit in with what's expected of them, but not necessarily feeling part of it, not feeling really appreciated or thanked. There's not an enrichment that comes from that hard work and investment. So that's the sort of things that could come up from that Scorpio new moon eclipse. But the total lunar eclipse is a whole other bag of celestial tricks, because it's really, really tough. Now I'm just, if you would bear with me, going to move one chart wheel off. So this event occurs on the 8th of November 2022, and on the screen now you can see what time it occurs in all the major cities of the world. Now, as ever, when I do my presentations, I base my chart on Greenwich, Universal Central Time. The reason I do this is not because I live in Great Britain, United Kingdom. It's because it's the centre of time. I don't say that in any kind of imperialistic way. It just seems to have been the story that unfolded. And this gives us an overall barometer, an astral barometer. But of course, you may watch presentations from other astrologers where they will use their local place, New York, Los Angeles, Tokyo, whatever, and will come up with a different ascendant. But the interesting thing is the ascendant on the total lunar eclipse is also Sagittarius, our desire to be free. And you can see on the screen now the event chart wheel, which shows Mercury very close to the Sun in Scorpio. Venus is still close enough, but it's just not in an exact conjunction. And on the other side of the heavens, you can see that Uranus and the Moon are very close together. Again, the North Node not very far away, but the big takeout is the position of Saturn, because Saturn, like the total or the partial solar eclipse, is in house 2, restricting the availability of everyday money, also making us fearful perhaps, or concerned or anxious about the lack of security there is at the moment, whether it's energy security or whether it's just having enough money to make ends meet. But that position of Saturn is pivoting between the Sun, Mercury and Venus, and the Moon, Uranus and the North Node in a T-square. So Saturn's on the point between them. So Saturn is having a huge impact on this particular natal event, and it will do over the next 6 months. You can see also that Mars has moved from that combative 7th house that it was on the solar eclipse, I do what I want when I want, into the 6th house. We're now starting to think about the detail of things a little bit more. It's still in the sign of Gemini. You can see it's now in retrograde as it became at the end of October, but it's still in the square with Neptune, which can be very distorting, but it's also now in a square with Jupiter. So it's saying that if we're too optimistic with our resources, because you can see Neptune and Jupiter has rewound in its retrograde back into Pisces, they're in the 2nd house of everyday resources, just like Saturn. But those two, you know, I have Neptune conjunct Jupiter in my natal chart, pretty well exact, and those two can be very much to do with heightening our frequency in terms of our spiritual and healing understanding, but also in that square with Mars, you're talking about exaggeration central. So they are in the 2nd house, they want to go for it, but Saturn's saying, whoa, no, you can't. And look where the Moon and Uranus and the Node are, in the 4th house of our need for emotional and physical security. But the Sun, Venus and Mercury are still in that 10th house. There's a lot of chatter in the wider world about how we're going to deal with things. But the fact is, the midpoint between the Sun and the Moon is actually 16 degrees in Aquarius, and that is conjunct Saturn. So it happens to be in the 1st house, that midpoint. So it means we have a dissociate conjunction with Saturn. But I really feel that the impact of this particular eclipse is going to be really quite rough over the next months to come. So I think some of the increases in energy, I mean, it varies where you are in the world. So I've read that, you know, in France, where I visited recently, electricity's gone up 4%, but the provider's owned by the people. So it's still a utility owned by the collective. Whereas in Britain, where private companies have got involved with very little restriction, energy prices have gone up 145%. Where's the justification of that? So it may differ from where you are in your particular part of the world, but the scarcity of resources, particularly agricultural products, is definitely a factor. Obviously, COVID has had an enormous effect on all the bank balances of all the big or small countries of the world. And then more latterly, we've had a restriction on grains coming from Ukraine, and even some raw products from Russia that have been, part and parcel of how we go about things. They have some raw resources that, due to restrictions, due to sanctions, aren't coming through. So everything's gone up in price. And, it seems to me that energy is very politicised now, which obviously is a very bad situation. So I think for us all, we're in for a bit of a rocky time over the next few months. Now, in terms of the simple birth chart, you can see that the Moon and Uranus are in house 2, very much about sudden expenses and costs, unexpected costs, opposed by Mercury and the Sun in Scorpio. But Mercury actually can be a real asset to us in Scorpio, because it can help us to probe, to understand things at a deeper level, to get beneath the surface. But we do still have that Mars-Pluto quincunx, which is in the solar eclipse chart as well. So there's still that potential turbulence around the use of very heavy-handed control, essentially. Or we've got governments that want to maintain a level of control based very much on credo, on dogma, rather than what kind of works for most citizens in the most consensual way. That seems to be a big problem in the United Kingdom at the present time. So there's going to be a lot of industrial disputes coming from this particular chart, because a lot of people, Saturn in Aquarius, the collective, are feeling very unhappy about miserly governments trying to pinch back where they can costs from COVID, from the Ukraine, from Brexit. That's my proposition. That's probably going to get me into hot water with quite a few people, but that's what I believe. And all of this is a melting pot of discontent and strain on just ordinary citizens' ability to do or go about their everyday lives in however way they wish to do so. So I feel that this is one of the most challenging total lunar eclipse that I can ever remember seeing. Now, the great news is that if we fast forward through to next 20th of April, we get the blue moon, the second Aries new moon of the month, but this one is a solar eclipse, and it also conjuncts with Jupiter. So that's an opportunity to really start again, a fresh start, individual ideas, initiation that comes from the sign of Aries, getting on the front foot, putting some of the past behind us. Are we going to see a change of government in the United Kingdom, for example? Are we going to see a change of government in Russia, for example? Will it make any particular difference? But then we have the lunar eclipse in Scorpio of the 5th of May. Uranus is still in the mix. Things are still unsettled. But as I mentioned before, the ruler of the sign of Taurus and obviously the ruler of the sign of Libra, very much about relating, Venus, is in an absolutely cracking link with Jupiter. So Venus, the lesser benefit, Jupiter, the greater benefit, really bubbling away. Venus in Gemini, ideas. Jupiter in Aries, getting a fresh start. So a lot of better energy is coming next spring for us all, I feel. But I feel this is going to be a difficult period of time where we all need to dig down, think very carefully about why we need to consume things in particular ways. It's made a lot of people, perhaps of my age, think about their childhoods and, with the ice growing inside the windows. There was no central heating. There was no carpets in my house for a period of time. There was no curtains. My father died. We lost our house, our business, my dad. And, we lived in absolute poverty. And that wasn't, sadly, that uncommon in Britain in the late 60s, early 70s. But there were compensations. So I saw on Twitter earlier about, do you remember when you used to wait all week to get your comic? So as a kid, you get your comic. So if you liked humour, you might get the Beano. If you liked sport or a bit of bish-bosh in terms of sort of more thrust-in adventurous stuff, you get the Hotspur or the Victor. And, if you're a girl, you look out for the Jackie and so on. So these were the things that made people really happy in those days. We didn't have all these consumer devices and these ways of sort of making life a little bit easier, but also probably, in some ways having huge impact on the planet. And we'd have to ask ourselves, are we all entirely more satisfied with our existence? There obviously are a lot of things about modern day life which are profoundly better. We have much more voice for equalities, for example, which is fantastic. A lot of things would have been hushed up in those days, which would have been of a seriously unpleasant nature. So there is a lot of good things that have evolved since then, but some of the simple pleasures of life is what these two events are asking us to embrace, and to free ourselves of our addiction to consumerism. You may feel that this is a very political message from me, but as Pluto goes into Aquarius briefly in 2023, I did read quite a distinguished astrologer saying Pluto moves into Aquarius in 23 for the foreseeable future. It does not. It comes back into Capricorn after a brief stint, and then it moves into Aquarius on the 21st of January 2024. And we're seeing the breaking down of some of the genesis of some of the economic policies that have got out of shape in certain parts of the Western world. Not all of them. There's much more balance in some areas of the Western world than there is, I think, in the United Kingdom and possibly in the United States, where we get great extremes of wealth but great extremes of poverty. And I know it's a very contentious thing that I'm saying, and I think what Pluto and Aquarius is asking us to do is become much more mindful of our connections to each other and not our connections to our valuables, our status, our properties, our cars, our big jobs. It's more important our connection to others, and that's going to be the defining element of how people will judge us in the years to come. That's what younger people will be demanding, a much greater network of support for one another, and having as reasonable as possible reward for our labours, but not being in a situation where we're almost harking back to Dickensian times with some of the policies that are being projected, let's put it that way, by the British Conservative Party. So now please stay with me, and I'm going to share each of the 12 zodiac signs and what you can expect over the next 6 months. So Aries, with your ruler Mars, certainly in terms of the solar eclipse, forging that really potent and powerful 150-degree angle with Pluto in your sector of success. If you feel that you can't express yourself in terms of how you fund your lifestyle, if you're in a role which seems to be very limiting, it's not very collegiate, you don't feel that your input matters much, you don't feel your intellect is being stretched very much, I think big changes need to come for you over the next 6 months. And I think that solar eclipse, which occurs in fact the double new moon in your sign on the 21st of March and then the 20th of April, is going to be an opportunity to really relaunch yourself. And I know that sounds a long way away, but I feel that this is a process for you. And if you do feel a bit disorientated or a bit drained, perhaps with Neptune in your 12th house, it wouldn't be a complete surprise. And feeling that everything is about the toil just to make ends meet, I feel that you're needing something bigger and more visionary in order to excite you. But of course, you can be at your best when you initiate. So yes, the two eclipses may be upsetting the status quo. The sign of Taurus, of course, like Scorpio, is fixed. So one of its great attributes is the fact that it can be very constant. But having Uranus there, of course, is very anti-fixed. So that's perhaps persuading you that even if there's been something you've clung on to that's worked very, very well, and not in a particularly sort of subservient way, but you just thought, look, it may not meet all of my needs, but actually this is, something that I'm practical about. It has some benefits to me, and I can do other things as well. I think you're going to be really challenged over the next 6 months to perhaps think of the ways in which you can reinvent your approach to quite a few situations. And if it means being more outspoken, if it means ventilating your viewpoint to those who are in a position of authority, or you want to give yourself an opportunity to free up your ability to go forth and absolutely galvanize people with all your talents, I think that this is a wonderful time to think about that. And if some things do make way, they make way. But of course, having Venus in the mix on both events does suggest that there could be some impact involving someone else. Or is there somebody coming into your world who's actually going to make your heart race faster? Because Venus conjunct the Sun and the Moon on that solar eclipse in the 8th house of the collective, but particularly for you, can actually be quite intense. It could be someone who is really going to be very mesmeric, intense, but make you feel that you're alive. And if you do have someone entering your world like that, I think the chances are that this is going to give you more confidence to perhaps liberate yourself from something that's just mediocre. So with Scorpio energy, it is, like I said about Venus, it can be a bit black and white. So are you being pushed to really think about some deep transformations in your life? And Mars and Pluto could give you some conflicts or contrasts in the approach you take. But essentially, if you're not really feeling fulfilled about your future, you'll need to do something about it. And with Saturn moving into your 12th house on the 7th of March next year, maybe something that you have had quite a close connection with for some while, maybe that needs to make way to bring in new energy and new possibilities for when Saturn and Neptune move into your sign in 25. Now Taurus, for you, obviously the collection of energy in the sign of Scorpio is very much about relationships. And having Venus, your ruler, on the 7th house can really bring your more diplomatic and reasoning side to the fore. If there is an opportunity to find a way to make things work with somebody that you really respect, this really can be very attractive to you. It's just that because of the restlessness that you may be feeling, if you're not getting the connection back from the other person, if they're not working as hard as you are and trying to understand where you're coming from, it can lose its momentum. And I think Saturn in the 10th house suggests that some of the relationships that you might struggle with might actually be to do with your work, to be honest. So for example, if you work in an environment where you're very good at it, but you don't tend to get much sort of feedback or engagement or satisfaction from the service you offer, even if you know it's a worthy role, that could make you think about how you could change it. But Saturn in the 10th house may be thinking, yeah, but that goes against the grain of your nature to try to keep things steady in order to maintain a degree of stability and continuity, which are very important to your nature. And of course, Mars, the planet of desire, is in your 2nd house on both these events. That's giving you the desire. And Pluto's in your 9th house of wanting to break free of anything that's not really working very well. So I feel that you could be conflicted a little bit about relationship matters based on just pure material security. And that's totally understandable. However much you're fond of someone, with Venus in the mix, I think you're going to be particularly aware of any relationship which is not working as well as it could do, but particularly where you've really tried to make it work. And if you're staying in that relationship because it feels that maybe it's a bit of a safer thing to do, that actually can become quite throttling to your very being, your very essence. And once Saturn moves into your 11th house of the future in March, you may have less choice in the matter. And do remember also that Jupiter's going to be moving into your sign next May the 16th, which is exciting, and it's going to come on the back of that rather lively lunar eclipse in in your opposite sign in next May, but with the solar eclipse, the following solar eclipse in Aries in the spring, perhaps that's giving you a little bit of an insight that maybe there are some things that need to make way in your life, but are you going to hold on because it just feels more secure? So I think that could be the dilemma if you're in a long-term relationship which isn't really very dynamic. If you're single, I think someone can definitely come into your life in the next 6 months who can excite you, but that person also needs to understand that need of yours for basic security. So you could have an initial rush of excitement, but still meeting that part of your nature will still be very important. So Gemini, what's the opportunity for you from the solar eclipse? Well, I think it's to think about how you might grapple with your daily routines and in some way bring maybe a little bit of creativity to the process with Venus's help, but also become perhaps a little bit more conscious of the things that you might be doing that are giving you a bit of a buffer from the more feeling side of your situation, because with Venus there, this is where we may comfort each a little bit. You know, what are the things that you find rather tempting that you know perhaps that you should cut back on somewhat? Those are the things you could grapple with on the back of the solar eclipse. If there is something psychological in your situation that you're finding a bit more challenging, the total lunar eclipse does mean that over the next 6 months, you simply cannot ignore something that's been calling out for your attention for some time now. Now, obviously, it depends exactly where your personal planets are. For example, you could have some in the sign of Taurus. If you have more than just the sun in Gemini, then the other influences can also be affected by that 12th house energy. And because Uranus is there and Saturn is in the 9th house, the 9th house is about amplification, it's about growth. But Saturn, of course, is about restriction and repression in some ways. So there may be some kind of essential truth about your psychological situation that you're trying to keep down or take or find every technique possible to avoid looking at. But Uranus in the mix suggests that somehow or another those feelings, those thoughts, those anxieties, those old issues that may be dormant or you thought they were dormant may be calling out for your attention. And with Mars in your sign in retrograde, but in that very powerful quincunx with Pluto in your 8th house, I think finding a good balance really between the things you want to achieve for yourself that gives you a sense of satisfaction in terms of how you divide your individual hopes with where you're invested in your relationships to others, or perhaps how you make money from your talents. All these things feed into your sense of well-being or not, depending on your personal unique circumstances. So I think your nervous system is likely to be sensitive. So very important to use the solar eclipse energies to reform the physical domain, and in that sense, if you get a bit fitter, a bit more organized, a bit more streamlined, that can help you to feel better in terms of your inner world. But if there is something that you're finding rather challenging, the great news about Uranus is there's a great deal of electric energy coming from Uranus, but it's being resisted by the fixed energy of Taurus. But the great news about Uranus is the planet of truth. So if you illuminate yourself more about your inner world, then that's going to help you to feel better in terms of your overall holistic well-being. And that's the opportunities and the challenges for the next 6 months for you. Now, Cancer, having the 11th, 5th house access stimulated really could be very, very positive, because the combination of the solar eclipse and Venus could make you want to be more affectionate, more playful, mixing and mingling more. But Uranus on the moon in the 11th house could want you to do almost precisely the opposite. Actually distance yourself from the people or situations that you don't find very gratifying. But Venus can provide a sweetness despite it being detrimented in the sign of Scorpio. So it can certainly give you the desire for greater warmth, but I feel that what Uranus will do is help to keep you right. So in other words, it's pushing you not to sacrifice your personal freedom or your longer term direction on the basis of immediate sociability or a romantic opportunity if it's not really absolutely right for you. So the authenticity of Uranus is really going to help you on the total lunar eclipse, but having Saturn in the 8th house just suggests that whichever part of your life you're trying to work with, whether it is your longer term planning, it is your friendships, your social interests, or it is more about your personal creativity and self-expression, or your love life, how you're invested in others and the money involved in that investment. It doesn't, obviously investment doesn't have to be only from a fiscal viewpoint, but I think Saturn in the 8th house is where you're perhaps feeling the desires you have are not being reciprocated. And because Mars in retrograde on the total lunar eclipse is still in that very challenging 150-degree angle with Pluto, any dark stuff from your past which is rising up from the depths, whether it's what other people have done to you that was grievous and unfair, or it's some things that you're not feeling completely at ease with, somehow or another, that combination can push stuff into the open, and there could be some frank discussions to be had, which actually, for someone like you, who will go to the ends of the earth to avoid confrontation very often, but all that does, unfortunately, is store up a lot of unresolved bits and pieces of emotional information that you may have very shrewdly worked through, huge amounts of things that haven't necessarily gone exactly to plan, but it's the residual bits that Mars in the 12th house has a talent for stoking up from the depths in a way that we can be quite surprised by. And because Uranus in the 11th house is very much Aquarius energy, even though it is in the sign of Taurus, it is emphasizing the truth seeker credentials of Uranus. So if you do find some information being discussed that's rather tender or sensitive, try to go with it, because I feel that this can help to really give you a sense of closure by the time Mars enters your sign, which will be at the end of March next year. And especially with Saturn moving into your 9th house of the higher truth in early March next year, the 7th, I think that this pattern of trying to resolve the reality on situations and come to terms with some of your disappointments or hurts or angers is actually an ongoing process that eventually will give you a lot of redemption. Now, Leo, for you, the solar eclipse is in your sector of home, family and emotion. Now, you're someone who can be enormously generous, and Venus on the Sun and the Moon like this could see you over the next 4 months, being very warm-hearted, perhaps in terms of hosting people, possibly for the festivities, being very generous to loved ones. Maybe you're making some physical changes to where you live, and if you do, you can do so with a great deal of aplomb and artistry. I was watching a little bit of a clip of a video on Facebook last night, and these guys used some steel ringlets or some metal ringlets, like caging, down the side of a corner of a room, and then they threaded all these dry flowers through it, which created this display, which it wouldn't necessarily be my cup of tea because it would use up some space. I like space, Aquarius, and of course I have Uranus in Leo and my midheaven in Leo, so I like space. And I'm also an astrologer. Uranus in the 10th house makes perfect sense. But that type of thing where you could be very creative about improving your home environment through your own artistry and flair could be something that really appeals to you. So if you are a maker or a creator, I think you're entering a very productive time over the next half year. It also could see you come up with some inventive ways of saving money. You know, whether it's making sausage dogs for the doors, or to exclude a few drafts, or, you know, making some nice knitted jumpers. Those kind of things actually can become really, really attractive to you. And actually, I think a lot of those things are really seen as quite funky and groovy these days. But the total lunar eclipse is a really another bag. It's another much more challenging skyscape. Here I feel that Uranus could push your emotions into the open. Pride is a very important thing with Leos. You don't necessarily have to be loved by everyone. You certainly like to be respected by everyone. Now, if people do like you as well and then adore you, well, obviously you're in your own personal seventh heaven. But that minimum requirement is for respect. But that means that sometimes you like to keep an implacable facade because you don't necessarily like people to see that you've got any vulnerabilities or weaknesses. But Uranus on the moon in the 10th house may make it more difficult for you to mask or hide any frustrations or worries you may have, particularly around your professional situation. So if you have a line manager or a colleague that you find it difficult to get along with Saturn in the mix as well, there may be a sense of coolness with people that you work with, or your prospects in terms of the wider world may seem rather limited. With Mars in your 11th house, that's giving you a desire to connect people in a collective way, whereas Pluto in the 6th house is seeing you much more conscious of the details, and maybe something that you're wanting to get other people to become much more conscious of in your professional situation will prove to be more challenging. But that's where the solar eclipse comes in, because I think retreating into your home world will actually give you a great deal of reassurance and a sense of calm and peace, an oasis in the storm. So I feel that that's how the two eclipses are going to work out for you. Now, Virgo, the initial eclipse is in your 3rd house. This is going to give you an ability to articulate your ideas over the next half year with a great deal of aplomb. I think you can develop a way of being very diplomatic, sharing some of your thoughts and ideas. There could even be a relationship around a neighbour or someone you experience on an everyday basis that becomes a big part of your situation. The only thing to watch out with Venus is that Venus can be a bit synthetic through its rulership of Libra, and of course it is in terms of its essential dignities, it is detrimented in Scorpio. So it will be important to be sincere in what you're saying. If you're just being a bit of a smoothie in terms of having an ability to guide things in the way you want, that in itself may not be totally sufficient. You need to actually say how you feel, but just perhaps deliver the message with a degree of care. But then the total lunar eclipse really brings into sharper focus an aspect that's been pounding you for the last couple of years, and that is where you're someone who has often gained great satisfaction of helping others, providing services, getting a lot of personal satisfaction of being very organised in your approach. Uranus has been pushing you over the last few years to be much more radical and break away from some of those regular patterns, those structures and rituals that give you a sense of security. And I think because Uranus is on the moon, you could find yourself feeling quite changeable, and that may make you less predictable than you've been in the past. And people see you as a safe pair of hands, someone who'll go through the processes in a very thorough and systematic way, and they rely on you. But you know that they rely on you. You don't necessarily want to let them down, but if you feel that someone's relying on you to the point you're losing your identity, or you can't freshen things up, or your job feels stale, or your everyday life routines are stuck in a rut, then the lunar eclipse is pushing you to make a change. But it may be a change where you feel that you lose some of those structures which keep you straight as you see it. But with Mars in your 10th house, that's giving you much more ambition. And also I feel that in terms of your work, the role of Pluto is wanting you to be much more individually creative. So there's a bit of a rebel around you at the moment, Virgo, which is a bit uncharacteristic. So that needs to work into your situation, find an outlet. But that's where the solar eclipse can give you backup by helping you, even if you've got something more challenging to say, to deliver that message with that much more care and sensitivity. That brings us to Libra. Now for you, the solar eclipse could be very good news in terms of your finances. Now I know that may seem to go against the prevailing trends, but I think some kind of bonus could surprise you over the next 6 months. But equally, because of the fact that Venus is your ruler, you're being cautioned not to squander any gains on the things that give you some immediate satisfaction. You know, whether it's calorific goodies, whether it's spending money on fashion, whether it's just being a bit more frivolous with your resources. You're being cautioned at the moment not to be frivolous with your resources, because with Uranus on the moon on the total lunar eclipse, this is a chance or a time when there could also be some unexpected changes, particularly around your longer term finances. Something in the short term could give you a surprising bonus or plus, but just be aware that the longer term pattern could be quite unpredictable for the next 6 months. The fact that Saturn is in your 5th house is saying that however hard you work, you may feel that your value is not recognised as much as it should be. Also with Mars in your 9th house in retrograde, a desire to break out and not feel just penned in by everyone's emotional expectations of you, as it links with Pluto, is very, very strong. So important that you do find some new outlets for yourself, that you are imaginative and open to new ways of doing things, Uranus in your 8th house. But Mars in your 9th house pushes you to be daring, and I think Saturn in your 5th suggests that it's much better to be a bit more conservative in your approach and not be too gung-ho when it comes to resources or speculation. Now, Scorpio, for you, having the solar eclipse, especially if your sun is right at the start of Scorpio with Venus there, this is a marvellous time to give yourself some kind of dynamic makeover. Even if you're someone, because of your fixed nature, who has quite a set way of dressing and presenting yourself, your hair, your nails, whatever, changing things up could be really cathartic and fun and give you a real sense of uplift. Also, don't be surprised if more than one admirer beats their path to your celestial door over the next 6 months. In fact, some of the things that go on around your love life or relationships in general can turn out to be very suddenly developing, and that can go against the grain about that part of your nature that does like continuity, the fixed. If changes come about, you like to drive those changes. Mars, Pluto, very political planets. Mars is about power in some ways, but also desire. Pluto much more about control. So your two ruling planets are in conflict on both these events. So it's going to be important to understand in terms of your sex life that as much as you may have the desire to get close with someone, and it could get very horny, to be honest, I think the ideology of that person, their belief systems, how easy you find them to communicate with, will actually turn out to be the defining point of whether you stick around or not. Because Saturn's in your 4th house of emotion, forging that very frustrating right angle to the moon and also Uranus. If you feel fenced in or limited, however alluring or attractive or fanciable or incredibly good someone is in terms of their abilities around intimacy, I think there's much more that you need at the moment. So you need to be aware of that, because a lot of people are going to be showing an interest in you, which could give you some choices. If you're in a long-standing relationship and you are bored, this particular set of influences can be very tempting to make some changes. But that's where I would refer to my previous comments. It's not just about who you're attracted to. It's whether you can do business with someone, with their belief systems matching with yours, which I think is the most important thing in any relationship. But also if you can have conversations with them. So it can't just be predicated on pure lust. If it is, you may be in for a disappointment. So it's answering that side of your nature, but also staying in touch with the fact that the very charged up energy around your 7th house is making you intrinsically quite restless, changeable, and perhaps impatient. And that could be coming out on those people who are closest to you. So you may see it that they in some way are not understanding you, but maybe in some way they're responding to your energy that may not even require a conversation to transmit to them. Sagittarius. Now, no doubt about it, a solar eclipse in the 12th house could be very challenging, to be honest, particularly with Venus not at its best in Scorpio. So you're being asked to think about the quality of your associations over the next 6 months. Trust, sincerity, truthfulness are massive issues over this period of time. But equally, you could find yourself nostalgic, reminiscing for someone from your past. An old face could even turn up through social media, may even send you a text message. You need to really ask yourself some searching questions if that happens. If you're in an ongoing relationship and you're not feeling quite as fulfilled as you would like, I think this could be a time when you want to withdraw a little bit and think carefully about whether you can find the solutions. Because Mars in retrograde is in your 7th house, there's part of you that can be more forceful about your boundaries. And maybe with Pluto in the 2nd, maybe money is part of the issues, or perhaps you and someone you're close to have a different attitude to resources, and that can cause some issues too. With Saturn in the 3rd house and the Moon and Uranus in the 6th, the nervous tension and stress, which has been so prevalent for you over the last couple of years, that really can be activated over the next 6 months. So the more you embrace the psychological side of yourself and your relationships, but also commit to doing what you can to reform the physical world, particularly if you can be more attuned, and you often are, to new ways of doing things, being much more innovative. That's something that you have a great appreciation for. But maybe you're being asked to make some changes to how you do your work, or perhaps the people you work for, or perhaps it's to do with how your home life is structured. There may be some erratic energies there which can drag you down a little bit, and that could make you a bit feisty because of Mars in the 7th house. But just be aware that behind this may be some insecurities about your identity or your worth in terms of your attractiveness because of Venus being on the Sun and the Moon in the 12th house. So generally speaking, a chance to think very carefully about what you really want from your deepest ties, and just being prepared what you're prepared to give in terms of the practical side of things, the share of the domestic load and so forth and so on. And if you can be open to this process, that's going to dampen down the tension which has been so strong over the last 2 years. I will say that I think by about the first week of December, that tension should start to seep away a little bit. But of course, the way astrology works, the event charts of both these two eclipses are going to be active over the next 6 months, but I feel there will be an improvement for you by the start of December. So that's something to really look forward to. Now, Capricorn. The initial solar eclipse is in your sector of sociability, which is a great thing to have at this time of the year, the run up to Christmas. We've been denied a lot of fraternity over the last few years of COVID. If in your particular locality it's safe to mix and mingle. There's every chance with Venus there that someone in your social circle could become much more important to you over the next 6 months. This could go all the way to some kind of romantic attraction, but just be aware with Uranus on the moon in your 5th house of affection and warmth and love and romance, that can also make you very changeable in a way which is perhaps a little bit uncharacteristic for you. Saturn, your ruler, obviously forges that T-square between the position of the Sun and Mercury on the solar eclipse, and also Uranus and the Moon on the Mercury and the Sun on the solar eclipse, and the Moon and Uranus in Taurus. So a lot of stuff there. One of the things I would say is that don't compare yourself to anyone. If that's something that you've fallen into a little bit of a pattern of doing, how's that neighbour doing? How's this friend doing? Why is it these people have more social invites than me? That kind of stuff can actually be very bad for your self-esteem. And Saturn's really testing your sense of self and self-worth, being in the 2nd house. And there may have also been a drying up of an income stream, which has made this need to socialise more challenging as well. And because Mars is in your 6th house, that's asking you to be actually a little bit more virtuous and abstemious. But Pluto in your sign, in its link to Mars, is saying, I'll do what I want. And yes, I may need to make some sacrifices, but I'll do what I want. So there may be a little bit of hedonism that's competing with another part of your nature that's pushing you to take a more somber and sobrietous attitude to the use of your resources, splashing out, having fun. But then there's another part of you, if things are have been tough and you need some nights out to just escape from it all, whether it is in the midweek, like on a Wednesday, and you feel that you need to let your hair down a little bit, or it is at the weekends, I can understand why you would want to do that. But certainly, in terms of your love life, there could be a degree of unpredictability, and because you are a very thoughtful sign, you need to have a degree of stability and security that feeds your sense of self. But also, if you're feeling that your sense of self is a little bit wounded at the moment, there could be another part of you that yearns for excitement and being with people who really do push the boundaries and push them hard, and that can give you a nefarious thrill. So there's a bit of a conflict in your particular situation over the next 6 months, as you can see. Aquarius, now having that combination between the Sun and Venus in your 10th house on the solar eclipse could see over the next 6 months your profile going up. People can be much more aware of your ideas, the way you articulate your ideas, your way of being, whether it's in your locality or in your work or in your more public role, just seems to take on a heightened quality. So that resonance is going to be really quite delightful. What's much more challenging perhaps on the lunar eclipse is what's going on at home. The last couple of years with your 2 co-rulers in this ongoing attritional quarrel may have left you feeling very low on physical vitality, Saturn in the 1st, but also very conscious if there's not much space where you live, or perhaps conversely you have too much, or perhaps you don't particularly like the environment that you live in, whether it's the actual community, the physical area or the location, or whether it's much more to do with you yearn to be in somewhere that's buzzier, more stimulating, or there's another part of you that wants to be in nature and somewhere more rural. So all these issues have been playing out over the last couple of years. What the solar eclipse can do is, if you do have more success financially and in terms of goals, ambitions and recognition, that could create extra funds to give you more choices or more options in terms of what you can do with where you're living. So that could be by adapting your home space. Uranus, of course, gives you that side of your nature that can be quite ingenious at times. So if you can find a way to modify your living situation just to make it work for now, but at the same time, marshal your resources wisely, then that could be something that really calls out to you. Pluto in the 12th house, however, still means that there just seems to be incoming still from certain individuals about certain parts of your nature that they seem to find difficult to deal with. But I think you're being really protected by the Sun, Venus and the Moon all together in the 10th house. And that can bring extra recognition your way and perhaps push into the background some of the doubting Thomases. And remember, as Pluto goes into your sign for that short interval in 23, but full time from 24, the 21st of January onwards, we really do start a new epoch for us all. You can see the old epoch, the Capricornian epoch, breaking down before our eyes. So there's lots to be excited about. So some of those people that you may feel have been taking pot shots at you, they're going to be the people who are going to have to really buck up their ideas in terms of coming into the present and seeing what the new reality is. So because you may be different in some ways rather challenging, well, just embrace it even more. Strut your stuff with even more self-belief, because with Mars in the 5th house, you're certainly giving out a very funky and alluring and perhaps even a very attracting vibe, which could be very good for your love life. Perhaps someone through your work is going to be someone that you encounter in the next 6 months in a positive way. But I think at the heart of you, it's trying to get the base of your existence working in a way which feels comfortable and settled. And once this aspect between Uranus and Saturn, your two rulers, finally ends on the 3rd of December this year, I think you're going to just see things falling into place a lot more. Which brings us to the wonderful Pisces, definitely last but not least. So for you Pisces, the combination of the Sun and Venus in your 9th house, your fellow water sign, is very much about your highest ideals. So I feel in a way this emphasizes your Jupiterian instincts around your sign. Jupiter governs traditionally the sign of Pisces, but of course it also governs the sign of Sagittarius, which, guess what, is the 9th house. But if you want to, embrace some greater exposure or activities around retreats or healing or spirituality or anything to do with the type of dimension that astrology can illuminate you with, or other forms of divination, then I think that's something that can be very gratifying in the following 6 months. Also, if you're someone who's fortunate enough to be able to travel, you're going to find it a very immersive experience, whether it's where you live in your own country or state or territory, or it is somewhere that's further afield. You can just soak up everything in a very rich way. You can encounter people who see things very differently to you, but people who you find very interesting, attractive. What's not to like? Well, it's just that part of you that comes through the lunar eclipse that doesn't want to change, that wants to keep things as they are. But the more you try to keep things as they are, with Saturn oppressing the Moon and Uranus and also the Sun, the more tension it's going to cause. Are you letting fears and inhibitions and anxieties prevent you from actually breaking out and being much more dynamic, like the solar eclipse is asking you to be? You could go through an inner conflict, quite honestly. Also, Mars is in your 4th house in retrograde, which can be defensive and prickly, but equally Mars in the 4th house could see you want to take action about where you live. And because Pluto's in your 11th house of the future, if you feel your current abode isn't going to serve your long-term purpose, that may be where you want to make the changes. But a lot of restlessness is around you, and if you can find some practical ways to burn that off, new interests, being more physically active, getting more exercise, taking up new interests and hobbies. If you're feeling bored and listless, this is a set of eclipses to really work with. And if you don't work with them, I think it's just going to amplify the frustration that you're feeling. So it's a time to face up to some of the things that pen you into the same old routines, the same people, the same kind of work. You're being given a chance to change things, to be more spontaneous and daring. Seize the opportunity with both of your gills. Thank you, Pisces. It's been a real pleasure sharing your 12 forecasts from Aries through to Pisces for these 2 eclipses that are going to dominate over the next 6 months. Thank you so much for joining me, and goodbye.